Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Welcome to our special, The Dems Plot to Undo America. We're going to focus on three things today. We're going to talk about the Democrats' threat to add states in order to increase the number of senators, court packing, adding members to the Supreme Court in order to dilute the influence of the conservatives on the court, and then thirdly, to get rid of the Electoral College and create their democracy that they want in America, which our founding fathers purposefully and correctly did not make. They avoided. Let me start off here first with proof of each of these claims, and then we'll bring in our wonderful guests today. Real quick, actually, before we do that, have you ever heard of any Republicans talking about doing anything like this ever? Right? Have you ever heard any Republicans ever talk about splitting Texas into a couple different states to get more Republican senators? Have you ever heard about Trump packing the court? Like, why can't Trump just pack the court if he wins? He should come out now and say, I'm going to pack the court if we win. And then the Dems will have to come out against it. On the court packing, this was a moment from the debate the other day.
Right. I have one final question for you,
Sure.
Mr. Vice President. If Senate Republicans, we were talking originally about the Supreme Court here, if Senate Republicans go ahead and confirm Justice Barrett, there has been talk about ending the filibuster or even packing the court, adding to the 9 justices there. You call this a distraction by the president, but in fact, it wasn't brought up by the president. It was brought up by some of your Democratic colleagues in the Congress. So my question to you is, you have refused in the past to talk about it. Are you willing to tell the American people tonight whether or not you will support either ending the filibuster or packing the court?
Whatever position I take on that, that'll become the issue. The issue is the American people should speak. You should go out and vote. You're in voting now. Vote and let your senators know how strongly you feel. Vote now.
Are you going to pack the
Make
court?
sure you, in fact, let people know you're a senator. I'm not going to answer the question
Why
because
wouldn't you answer that
because
question?
the question is
Supreme Court justice, radical left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe? Who's on your list?
Right. Gentlemen, I think
this
we've
is
ended
so
this.
He's going to pack the court.
We have
not going to give a list.
We have ended this segment. We're going to move on to the second segment.
That was really a productive segment, wasn't it? Keep yapping, man.
The people understand, Joe.
They sure
47 years you've done nothing. They understand.
All right.
So ridiculous. 28 seconds after asking the question, Walz cut it off without requiring Biden to ever answer the question. It's not just Trump not being willing to answer. I mean, here's a bunch of liberal senators and congressmen, Joe Kennedy, Jerry Nadler, Blumenthal. Schumer said nothing is off the table if the Democrats win. This is the dean of the Berkeley Law School. One way for the Democrats to make clear they will not tolerate Republicans trying to fill the seat is for them to pledge that if they take the White House and Senate in November, they will increase the size of the Supreme Court to 13 justices. Again, that's the dean of the Berkeley Law School. We could go on, and we will a little later when we talk about that. On adding states, this is a headline from The Atlantic. And the article says, perhaps there could be a North and South California or an East and West Massachusetts, a new state of Long Island, an area that's geographically larger than Rhode Island and would be more populous than most of the presently existing states. So what they want is, the Democrats say the problem is that there's 2 senators for Delaware with no people and 2 senators for California with 38 million people. So it's not even. But that's not what, does that make sense? So it's not, you have some senators representing millions of people and some senators representing a few number of people. So we need more senators to even that out. But that's not what the Senate is. The Senate's there to represent the state. Before the 17th Amendment, we used to have the state legislatures would elect their senator, their representative to go to DC to represent the state. And each senator represented one state. It's the House, it's the Congress that represents a proportional number of people. Each congressman represents the same number of people. That's why they're all different sized, geographically different sized districts. So that's the same number of people, right? So it's the House that does that. The Senate, well, senators also represent the same number. It's just the same number of states, 1, or each state is 2, right? But that's what that is. The guy who wrote that article in The Atlantic, on the bottom it says it's part of the project at The Atlantic called The Battle for the Constitution in partnership with the National Constitution Center. And all the articles in this project are things against the Constitution. So not only these other states, but they also want to add D.C. and Puerto Rico to become states as well. By the way, no one tell them that the governor of Puerto Rico is a Republican. But anyway, they assume that all brown people are going to vote for Democrats always. There's also this harebrained idea, which we're not going to give much talk to, but that to turn Washington, D.C. into 127 different states. So that, whatever. The big one. End the electoral college. This is what the Democrats want to do more than anything. This is the New York Times. This is their editorial board. This is the left's obsession with the popular vote. The popular vote, by the way, it's not a thing. Doesn't exist. Not a thing. People talk about the popular vote like it's a thing. It's not a thing. Feinstein and others have introduced, of course, a constitutional amendment to get rid of the electoral college. But we're going to talk coming up why we don't live in a democracy for a reason. And unless you want New York City and LA to decide who our next president is from now till forever, which is, of course, what the Democrats want, you need to be against the Electoral College, among many other reasons as well. Now, in order to do that, you'd have to change the Constitution. You have to have a constitutional amendment. But there's a super shady way that the Democrats are trying to get rid of the Electoral College as well. They call it the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So the deal is, the states that pass this, and many states have, each state vows to give their state electors not to whoever wins the popular vote in their state, but to whoever wins the popular vote nationwide. So let's say the people of Colorado vote for Trump. If enough states sign on to this, and I don't know if Colorado did or not, I don't know why I just used Colorado as an example, but let's say people of Colorado vote for Trump, but if Biden wins the national popular vote, then Colorado would send Democrat electors to vote for Biden against the will of the people of their state, right? Now, this compact already has enough states to add up to 196 electoral college votes, and they need 270 in order to completely upend the electoral college process without even amending the Constitution. So there's only a few more states and they have it. So that's it. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to break down each of these coming up more and why they are all terrible, terrible ideas. Coming up next, the Democrats plot to undo America. More coming up. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Democrats plot to undo America. Coming up next, we're going to talk about adding states, the threat to add states, and then, of course, to end the Electoral College. Right now, I want to talk about court packing. I want to do that with our friend, Professor Adam Carrington. He's at Hillsdale College. He's also now a research fellow at the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. Professor, how are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. Hope you're all safe and sound.
Good to talk to you. We are. For now, until the Democrats pack the court. Let's talk about the history of this. So, because they're right in that the Constitution doesn't say there has to be 9 justices, right? So what's the history of the number of people on the court?
Yes, actually, all it says is there has to be a Supreme Court, and it mentions there needs to be a Chief Justice. Besides that, the number is completely left to Congress to decide. And we've actually had, there's sort of 2 sides of the story. We've actually had 7 changes to the court over the history of the United States. It started out with 6. We've had as many as 10. At the same time, the number 9 has been by far the most common. We've had it for 180 or so out of our 230 years. And we've had that number continuously since 1869. That was when it was set and hasn't changed since. So while it is true that Congress can set it whatever number they want and has changed it at times, by far the most common number and by far the most stable number for now a century and a half has been the number 9.
Why would one argue 9 is a good number? Obviously, it's an odd number, which is a good start. I thought it was weird that they started off with 6. That seems like the worst number to start with, right? How did that go?
Right. Actually, not as many ties as you'd be afraid would happen. I think you're right that it's good to have enough that there's a tiebreaker just in case you have some issue that really does split. Why the number 9, I think, is a little more an accident of history. I will say the debate, at least principally, has been you want enough justices to be able to do the workload, And I'll say actually another historical instance is justices used to have to do what was called riding circuit, meaning half the year they were Supreme Court justices, half the year they sat on lower courts in different parts of the country, and you needed enough justices to fill those. That didn't stop till late in the 19th century, which seems wild to us. But now I think the only thing that remains is the question: you want enough justices to be able to do the workload, but not so many that they can't talk to each other, that they can't work with each other, that they can't debate with each other. So there's kind of a question of what's the middle ground between those two. And I don't think that there's an easy, fast, absolute, perfect number, but 9 has seemed to be pretty workable over the last century and a half.
Yeah. And we don't have to spend time on this now, but that's a really wonderful thing that these justices do get along and debate. I mean, like, I have this vision in my head where they literally get around in like a mahogany room with a fireplace and like talk the issues out. Do they really talk them out like that?
Pretty close. It seems that from what people have said from the inside, and they seem to not be lying, is the court, despite its deep divisions on political or legal questions, has really kept a collegial atmosphere. The very fact that you saw Sotomayor saying that she disagrees with Justice Thomas all the time, but just loves the man, or the deep friendship between Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Scalia that was famous, seems to show that they don't paper over their disagreements about the law, but that they've managed to maintain a kind of collegiality that we don't see in other aspects of our political culture at this point.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thing, and I'm grateful for that. I vaguely know the story of John Adams politically changing the number of people on the court. Because my understanding is a lot of times when they added numbers on the court, it was because they like added different districts or different circuit courts or whatever, right? So because the country was growing. So it wasn't like a political motivation as much. But didn't John Adams cut the number of people on the court for political reasons?
Actually, he added the number of lower court justices, what was called the midnight judges, where he tried to pack the lower courts. And you're right, he cut the number of justices from 6 to 5 to deny the incoming President Thomas Jefferson another pick. And to be honest, we've seen a few more of these than just attempts to fill the circuits. That certainly happened. But what they also did, during the Civil War, for example, they expanded the number of justices to 10 to make sure that they didn't vote against Lincoln's Civil War policies. They cut it down to, I believe it was 7, to make sure Andrew Johnson, his replacement, didn't have any. So there were some times where it was political, and I think the fact that it's stayed at 9 since 1869, I think finally showed a frustration with making the courts political in that way. In fact, the most famous instance of court packing was a failed one, where for the first time since 1869, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s tried to expand the court to try to get a majority that agreed with him, and even large elements of his own party shot it down. So I think while you do have brazenly political attempts in addition to just regular fill court slots attempts to do this, it's really gone, I think, for good reason, out of fashion since the middle of the 19th century. It really, they really saw that judges need to be, as much as we can, put them above those sorts of squabbles.
That's such a shady move to lower the number of justices on your way out. So that would be like, correct me if I'm wrong, if he couldn't get Barrett in because whatever happens, so he would lower the number of justices from 9 to like 7, right? So that Biden couldn't add any more. Is that what that move would be?
That has happened. It happened to Thomas Jefferson. It happened to, like I said, Andrew Johnson. It hasn't happened a whole lot, but there have definitely been those instances.
Wow.
And it was absolutely to deny a pick to the next president.
So yeah, totally blatant. There was like no even like pretending, oh, it's really because of this. It was like straight up, like straight up stick it to the next guy. That's pretty awesome.
Well, they gave a thin veneer of a reason, but that was,
sure,
I think, the main reason in those instances. Yeah.
So FDR wanted to pack the court with 6 more, right? And blatantly also he wanted to do that because they didn't deny his New Deal stuff, right? What were the arguments against it then, particularly from the people in his own party?
Right. He did give the argument at first that, well, the court is old and many of the justices were over 70. We see that right now, too. And that maybe they needed help because they were in trouble. In other words, they were overworked. Then the Chief Justice at the time, Charles Evans Hughes, said, no, we're fine. We have we have no problem getting our work done. So then what he said was the court was too brazenly striking down his New Deal legislation, and we needed the court to be in line with the times and in line with the American people's will, which had voted him in and a Congress that was Democrats. But I think the pushback from Republicans and from a large number of Democrats was, again, that the court should work differently than Congress and the president, and that what we need to do is preserve the idea that these men are interpreting and applying the law, not merely backing the political agenda of whoever is in power in the other branches, and that if FDR and the Democrats would keep winning elections, and they did, that the court would eventually start to reflect them anyway based on the will of the people, which is ultimately, by the way, what happened.
Yeah, that's right. Was he close to packing the courts, or was this just kind of a harebrained idea?
It got some serious early consideration in Congress right after the 1936 election, where he was reelected by an even greater margin than he had won in the landslide in 32. But it fizzled out after a couple months of debate. And so while it did get some serious consideration, it's not clear that it ever got that close to an actual vote.
Okay.
So it went beyond words.
Yeah. It's a big thing that we learn about in grade school, right? Is the court packing. I distinctly remember reading about that in history. So I was curious how much of an actual thing it was. Let's talk about two other reforms that I've heard thrown out there other than just adding people to the court. Let's do the first would be term limits. So I've heard this idea of maybe 18-year terms or something like that. What do you think about that? What did our founders think about? Why did they do lifetime appointments?
I see the argument for it. I'm still more convinced by the founders' argument. And their point was that twofold. One, you want a certain level of independence in the judges so that they're not worried about the end of their term. They certainly didn't want them reappointed or reelected. But they wanted it to be a lifetime, not just a set 18 years either, is the idea that over the court that the law gets complicated. The law gets intricate, and the history of law gets intricate. And if you find a really good judge, then it's a good idea to keep them in office, to maintain that level of expertise in the law, the ability to craft the law and the judicial opinions well. And if you've got a Scalia, why would you want him to go? And I think that was the idea, is you want that stability and knowledge in the law because of the complications that come up with it. I see the other arguments. I see the worry about partisanship, the worry that 5 weeks, 6 weeks before an election, a judge could die and throw politics into a tizzy. So I don't think those are unfounded, but I still find more convincing that you want to maintain that stability and knowledge in the branch. And if you've got a good judge, it's not a bad thing to try to keep them as long as they're able to in a good way.
Yeah, and the idea of like coming to the end of their term could be an interesting phenomenon that's not great. Well, on that point, there's also thrown out this idea of age limits. So you have to retire when you're 70 or something. What do you think of that?
I think that that's reasonable. We have age limits on the lower side for members of Congress and the president. And I think it's something that we might want to ask whether we want to make it movable to some degree, because obviously some people are able to keep their mental acuity longer than we used to. Life expectancy is longer than it used to be. At the same time, I don't think it's ridiculous. We've had those for juries in the past at the state level. I'm not quite sure what would be practically the right age or the right way to discuss it. That said, it would take an amendment to the Constitution, but I don't think it's ridiculous to say that we want to protect the mental ability of the court. And there certainly have been instances where we've had justices unable to perform their duties in the past and had to take some rather creative measures behind the scenes to make sure that they retired.
Interesting. I thought you would dismiss that, but I'll give it more thought, the fact that you didn't. That's interesting. Although, as you said, constitutional amendment, so it would take a long time. We got to go, Professor, but real quick, this is a big question, but the role of the Supreme Court is very, very different than what our founders intended, isn't it, today?
Yes, I think that the problem has been that there's been a misunderstanding about what judges are capable of doing. And it's interesting, I think in some ways that the fact that we have underestimated what judges are capable of doing has resulted in judges overselling or overusing their power. And what I mean by that is the whole idea of separation of powers was built on the idea that judges with the judicial power could limit their, could separate what they want from what the text of a law says and only apply what it says without imposing their own views, opinions, will, that's possible. And I think that a certain view of the judiciary has sort of assumed that you can't do that, that judges are just another way of imposing their own wills, just like a Congress does, that they're another kind of legislator. And what that lack of trust in the abilities of the judges has resulted in is a power grab because those people have seen themselves as just another legislature. And it's interesting how underestimating them has led to an over-assertion of power.
Interesting. And that's Amy Barrett's argument. She says people are coming at me for having my deeply held Christian beliefs. But she's like, everyone has deeply held beliefs that they need to put aside in order to properly assign the law, whether it's a Christian belief or an atheist belief, whatever. Everyone's got personal convictions that they need to put aside. So Professor Carrington, Hillsdale College, and now working at the James Madison program at Princeton, which is super exciting. Hopefully we talk about that another day. Thanks, Professor, as always.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me again.
Great insight. Dems plan to undo America. Coming up next, we're going to talk about adding states, adding Puerto Rico, D.C., maybe splitting some states in two to get more senators. We'll do that next. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Democrats plan to undo America. I want to start off with Hans von Spakovsky. How about that name? It's awesome. Senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Spakovsky, how are you, sir?
I'm doing just great, thanks.
Really good to talk to you. So I want to talk to you about adding states, because Democrats have talked about adding D.C., Puerto Rico, and even like this crazy harebrained idea to turn D.C. into 127 different states, but whatever. I want to talk about that in a second because relevant to this moment are mail-in ballots. And this is going to be a huge issue because, as we all know, the election results are going to come out that night, and Trump's probably going to be in the lead, and he's going to claim victory, but the Democrats are going to say, no, we got to wait for the mail-in ballots, and every state's different, and it's going to be madness and chaos. First of all, is it going to be madness and chaos in your estimation?
Well, potentially so, particularly if election officials and state officials keep encouraging people to vote by mail instead of voting in person. And the reason for that, why that's a bad idea, look, New York experienced why that's a bad idea. First of all, if you vote by mail, your chances of getting disenfranchised are much higher than if you vote in person. 1 in 5 ballots in the New York primary were rejected. And the reason for all this is clear. First of all, look, if you vote by mail, you're dependent on a third party, the U.S. Postal Service, to deliver your ballot. And the chances are, unfortunately, greater that they may not do that. They may not deliver it in time to be voted. Plus, election officials reject absentee ballots at a higher rate because voters make mistakes. They forget to sign them. They don't provide all the information that's required, or the Postal Service just forgets to postmark the ballot. So you should vote in person. But also, they're not prepared, election officials, to handle a huge increase in absentee ballots. That's what happened in New York. It's why it took them 6 weeks to count the ballots when normally we would know that night or the next day what the results are in the election.
Wow. So what's this New York primary? I missed that. So it was a New York primary, and it took 6 weeks to count them.
Yeah, they held the primary June 23rd, and they had a gigantic increase in people voting by mail because they told everybody, oh, you really should do that. It took them 6 weeks to count the ballots. And like I said, they had a huge rejection rate. Over 80,000 ballots in New York City alone were thrown out by election officials because they didn't comply with state requirements.
Whoa. And think about Wisconsin. Trump only won Wisconsin by a couple thousand votes in 2016.
Right. Right. So take what happened in New York and think about that happening in multiple states all over the place. Plus, look, unfortunately, absentee or mail-in ballots are more susceptible to being stolen, to being forged, to being altered. And we've seen that happening. You probably saw Paterson, New Jersey, tried to have an all-mail election for their municipal election, which was about 2 months ago. 4 locals have already been criminally charged with absentee ballot fraud, and at least one election there, a city council race, they have to have a new election because of all the problems with the absentee ballots.
Wow. Okay, so obviously Dems are going to say, oh, you're overblowing this fraud potential. There's not really a fraud, and even if it's just a couple ballots, not a big deal. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say that I could cite to them numerous elections that have been overturned because of absentee ballot fraud. Probably the one that affected Congress was just 2 years ago. Remember, 2018, there was one contested congressional race in the country. It was in the 9th Congressional District of North Carolina. That election was overturned. 7 locals were criminally charged with tampering with absentee ballots.
I never heard that. I've never heard of that. You know what I mean? Right? You don't hear about these stories. They don't want you to know these stories, right?
Right. I mean, that's part of the problem.
Okay, so what's going to happen is Trump's going to win, again, election night probably, and then he's going to try, or his lawyers are going to try to stop the counting, there's going to be a lot of lawsuits about all this. And then the Democrats are going to say, oh, these are probably Democrat ballots, you're stopping the vote. You're disenfranchising people by not counting all the ballots or whatever. How should we prepare for that as a country?
Well, what we should be prepared for is, first of all, a long delay in the count of the ballots if there's a huge increase in mail-in ballots. And second, unfortunately, we may see litigation over those ballots. In particular, we may see lawsuits claiming that not counting ballots that have been rejected because the signatures didn't match, for example, on the absentee ballots, or the Postal Service forgot to postmark them. So we don't know if they were actually voted by the end of Election Day like they're supposed to. We may say litigation over that, and we need to be prepared for that kind of thing happening after Election Day.
What would the Supreme Court, what would their role be in it? And I guess we got a couple minutes if you want to do a quick Gore v. Bush. Like, is there relevancy to that and what the Supreme Court's role in this election could be?
Well, the Supreme Court's role, I think, as it was in Bush v. Gore, could come into play if courts are changing the rules that were set out by the state legislatures after the election. You know, that's improper. Courts should not be doing that. It's the state legislatures that set the rules for the ballots, particularly absentee ballots, when the deadline is, when they're supposed to be received. And if they start making changes after Election Day, that's where the Supreme Court, I think, will step in, and properly so.
What did the Supreme Court do in Gore and Bush in that regard?
Well, if you recall, during the recount, the state courts there were changing the rules. They were changing the rules on what ballot should be counted. They were changing the rules set out by the state legislature. And the Supreme Court came in and basically said, look, you can't do, first of all, you don't have the authority to do that. Second, you can't do that after the election. And third, you can't change the rules set out by the state legislature on what ballots will be counted and not counted.
Is there a state you're most concerned about because either they're most woefully unprepared or they have maybe the wackiest laws?
Well, right now I am concerned about Pennsylvania because of the fact that the state Supreme Court there is acting in ways it shouldn't. They've already, for example, extended the deadline for the receipt of absentee ballots when they don't have the authority to do that. That's the state legislature's call. Wisconsin also has been a concern. We had courts there doing the same thing. A court of appeals has just stopped that from happening. But again, it's a kind of thing that courts should not be stepping into. And again, I'd encourage people to vote in person. You're risking, if you vote by mail, your ballot not counting because it may not get there in time or may be rejected because you make a mistake. That's not going to happen in a polling place.
Yeah, good. Okay, very good. Well, awful, but good insight. Professor, the Democrats are going to say, if they win, to heck with this voting thing. Let's just add a couple states, and that way we'll win no matter what moving forward. So what's the? I think we understand the idea, right? If they add Puerto Rico to be a state, if they add D.C. to be a state, they'd add, they think, more Democratic senators. What's the possibility of this happening in the future if they were to win? Obviously.
Well, look, D.C. already their votes there do count for the presidency. That was done through a constitutional amendment. But as you know, they are trying to make D.C. a state for the purposes of changing representation in the U.S. Senate and the House. They also want to do that in Puerto Rico. That would take a constitutional amendment. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think the people of Puerto Rico want that. They've had votes there to decide whether they want to continue as a territory or as a state, and they don't want to be a state for the reason that if you live in Puerto Rico, you don't have to pay federal income taxes, and they like that. They don't like the fact they don't want to have to pay federal income taxes, and I think it would be a big mistake to override what the people there want just for political purposes to make them a state.
So making a new state requires, what does it require?
A constitutional amendment.
Really?
I mean, to make a new state doesn't require a constitutional amendment. To make D.C. a state, that does require a constitutional amendment.
Okay, so to make D.C., got it. So to make D.C. a state does, and to make Puerto Rico a state, that would require Puerto Rico to sign on to it, right?
Yes, and it would require Congress to approve that.
Got it. Okay, interesting. Okay, so those are two pretty big hurdles. Very good.
Yes.
Now, I did hear do you know that Harvard Law Journal I'm speaking of about D.C.? Does that ring a bell? I just read this the other day, and it talked about turning D.C. into 127 different states because that would only require, right? That would only require Congress to do it. It wouldn't require, so if you want to split up another state, let's say you want to split up California into two states, right. California has to approve it, and then Congress has to approve it. But if you want to make D.C. into a bunch of different states, it would just require Congress. Now, that's like a harebrained idea, right? But
it is a harebrained idea, and I also think it's wrong. I don't think it's right. I think it takes, look, D.C. was set up as a special district under our Constitution, and I actually think it takes a constitutional amendment to change D.C. into a state or to change various parts of it into a state.
Yeah. Okay. So you think that Harvard is just factually inaccurate that just Congress can do it? Oh, interesting. Yeah, okay. Well, they don't address that. They didn't ask Hans von Spakovsky on that point. Right. Okay, so that all seems unlikely. Is that a fair conclusion here?
Yeah, I think it seems. I think that is a fair conclusion.
Okay, very good. All right. Any other final thoughts here, Hans, on what we are about to embark upon as a nation?
Well, I'll tell you. I do think, and I hope that whoever wins the presidency, I mean, I have my own favorite, I'm not going to tell you that, but I think whoever wins, I hope they win by a large margin so that we don't have problems with fraud, that we don't have problems with disputes in the courts over this. I don't think that'll happen if there's a large margin in the victory.
Yeah, I think it's fair. Whoever's going to win, just please win by a lot.
Yeah.
So we're not counting Chads. Hans von Spakovsky Heritage Foundation. Hans, appreciate your insight. Thank you, sir.
Sure, thanks for having me.
All right, more coming up next. Dems plan to undo America. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Democrats plot to undo America. So we've talked about court packing, we've talked about adding states, and now the big one, I would argue, the one that they really want to do, and that is get rid of the Electoral College and just have the president elected by this popular vote, which isn't a thing, but they want to indeed make it a thing. They sure talk like it's a thing, but it's not. But what is the Electoral College? Trent England is here. He's from SaveOurStates.org, and there's a documentary. It is free on Amazon with the Amazon Prime. It's called Safeguard, an Electoral College story. And if you watch it, it's an hour. You'll know everything you need to know about the Electoral College. Trent, how are you, brother?
I'm doing good, Mike. Thanks for having me on the program.
Yeah, man. So help us understand what were our founding fathers worried about that they even thought to make an Electoral College and not just have it majority wins?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because the concerns that they had at the time are still the concerns that people should have now. The big one was big cities, big states having too much power, right? I mean, and everybody knows that the Constitution has checks and balances. It's funny, you get to presidential election and it's like people sort of forget that, right? But no, they wanted checks and balances in the presidential election process. And so they said, look, we don't want a situation where the biggest cities, the biggest states can control the White House. And so we're going to make sure that they still have a lot of power. California has 55 electoral votes, right? But California only has 55 electoral votes, right? If you run up the score in California like Hillary Clinton did in 2016, that once you win those electoral votes, it doesn't help you. You've got to go out and talk to Americans in other parts of the country. This is the system that the founders created. And as I said, those concerns are still relevant today. They're actually more relevant today than they were in 1787.
David Harsanyi, we had him on the other day from National Review, and he wrote a book about democracy and how it's not a great thing. And he had a great line. He said, people don't like democracy as much as they think they do. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
We have this, what do you say to that? And what were our founding fathers worried about if they did get a democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just get all this stuff wrong. It's just all jumbled up in our thinking today, right? They wanted a government that protected individual rights and sort of promoted justice, right? And those things are in conflict with democracy. Democracy doesn't guarantee or necessarily even tend toward justice, right? I mean, democracy, if you turn it into a sort of overarching principle, democracy is just the will of the stronger, right? I mean, it's like, it is not the form of government that the American founders wanted. But if you're going to have a republic, right, if you're going to have a government that's about representation and justice and individual rights, the power still comes from the people, right? And so you use democratic processes, right? So it's not a democratic principle, it's a democratic process that we use. And the Electoral College is one of these. It's a two-step democratic process. And by having a two-step process, you create a little bit of room for potential deliberation, for things to go wrong. And you create these checks and balances where one region, one segment of the population only has so much power. And so you sort of program some minority rights into that system, even while you're having elections. And I think it's absolutely right. People don't really want to be governed simply by the will of the majority, because majorities are not always right. They're often wrong. And so we have a system that has lots of checks and balances and protections for all of us.
In the documentary, you talk about Stephen A. Douglas, who, of course, was going against Lincoln. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Stephen A. Douglas, his argument was majority. Right?
Yeah.
Majority of people in every state want it. Boom, end of story. There was no moral argument at play. There was no idea of protecting the rights of an individual, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, in the most dramatic, argument in American history over slavery, right? Stephen Douglas, I mean, this is something more Americans should know, right? Stephen A. Douglas just said, look, I'm not saying slavery is right. I'm just saying people want it, right? And if people want it, he said, look, Massachusetts, you don't want slavery, don't have slavery, right? But if Alabama wants slavery, who are we to say they're wrong, right? I mean, that's democracy, right? Stephen A. Douglas was a great proponent of democracy. And Lincoln said, hey, I think this whole government thing is about something higher, something, better than just giving power to a raw majority.
Yeah, so good. Bring it to today, what's the doomsday scenario of if we got rid of the Electoral College for, let's say, the next election? Or I guess we could do this election. If there was no Electoral College, how would things play out differently, you think?
Well, so, I think it's hard to say in this election because we're already in the middle of it. The reality is if you pull away the Electoral College, what you'll see happen over time is a fracturing of American politics, because and this is actually why, some much more, I think, sort of forward-thinking civil rights leaders back in the 1960s and 1970s were staunch supporters of the Electoral College, right? Back then, the NAACP was in favor of the Electoral College because they did not want a politics that winds up fracturing into, tens of splinter parties where, you have even more divisive politics than we see today, and where one region of the country can win, and a candidate like, say, a Michael Bloomberg, can step in with $1 billion and basically hold a party hostage, right? And say, well, you have to do what I want or I'll run. And if I run, I can guarantee that you lose because I can pull 15% of the vote away, right? There's a lot of things in politics that we even forget are possible in the United States because we have this system of checks and balances, but that you see play out in other countries. And, we would wind up with all of those problems here. And frankly, people don't realize a lot of other countries use electoral college type systems. Every parliamentary system is a two-step process to choose the prime minister. India has an electoral college. Germany has an electoral college, right? I'm not talking about those countries. I'm talking about places like, Mexico and Russia and Iran. These are the big popular vote countries, right? The one that's the most westernized is France. And France is not really a model of, good, stable politics. And a lot of that is because they have a direct election for president there, and it creates all these splinter parties and all of this, all this weird anti-democratic.
Okay, I want you to spell that out a little more. I got a side question about that, but I love this idea of if we didn't have Electoral College, you would have a Michael Bloomberg just get 11 million votes from New York City and LA, and there'd be no incentive for him to appeal to the rest of the country at all, and that would obviously be very bad. But I'm with you on the splintering of parties. I'm just reading this book now about Hitler's first 100 days, and there were a bunch of different parties in 1930 Germany, and he didn't have a majority. He didn't have a majority. The Nazi Party wasn't a majority, but there were all these different parties, and he was like the most popular of the group of like everyone in like polling in the 20s or whatever. So how does, if we got rid of the Electoral College over time, how would that lead to the splintering of the parties? I don't quite understand that. Why would we not still just have two parties?
Well, so the way it works right now, right, is that you have to win state by state. And so it's very hard for anybody to go out. You think about somebody like you go back to Ross Perot, right? I mean, Ross Perot in 92 and 96 was a relatively popular third-party candidate. He won, I think he won almost 20% or around 20% in 92. He didn't win any electoral votes, right? The Electoral College basically creates an incentive where if you're a Ross Perot, right, if you've got a bunch of people and they're frustrated, you have an incentive to go and work your ideas into one of the major parties, right? Yes. Rather than to go try to play ball on your own. And that's what we've seen. The parties, people talk about the American founders being anti-political party, but our political parties that developed in the United States are really big coalitions of parties, right? They're these big, really gangly, awkward, we get used to them, but they're not a natural sort of creation. They're a forced compromise of a whole bunch of disparate people. because they want to win elections, and most of all, they want to win the presidential election, and it incentivizes building a giant nationwide coalition,
Wow, that's
which
so
is
good.
really important.
That's so right, because I mean, it came up yesterday in the debate, or the other day in the debate. Trump criticized Biden for like not supporting law enforcement enough because you're going to lose the left wing of your party. But if we didn't have these big giant two parties, 'cause everyone bemoans the two-party system. That's a very popular thing. But I love this argument. It's like, no, two-party system is good, but each party is actually multiple parties. You got like the far left activists, you got the more centrist Democrats, you got the this kind of Democrat, the that kind of Democrat, the other kind of, which if we didn't have the Electoral College, you're saying would each be their own party. So the Republican Party would maybe fracture into 6 different parties, and the Democrat would fracture into 10 different parties, and then we'd just have no one polling above 8%.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, you really, the Republican coalition, right, is really, you got the pro-life party, you've got, now you have
gun,
sort of
Second
the
Amendment
Rust Belt party. Yeah, right.
Yes.
It's actually so different from what the founders had in their minds. And people say, oh, George Washington wouldn't want us to have parties. George Washington wouldn't recognize the Republican and Democrat parties as being parties in the sense that he thought of them, right? They're not these narrow special interest groups, right? I mean, in a sense, like maybe like Antifa or the NRA or like these narrower interest groups are more like the parties that the founders thought of them. And it is dangerous if you splinter into 100 different factions. That's what the civil rights leaders were worried about in the 70s. They said, look, we don't want to have a black party and a Hispanic party, right, and an Asian party. We want these parties to have to incorporate all of these different minority groups in them, because then the minority groups have a real voice, rather than feeling like, we're the minority, we're the black party that wants, in environmental justice, right?
Yes.
So we get to be happy over here by ourselves because we're all people who think the same way, but ultimately you have no voice in politics, right?
Gosh,
and that's what
love
happens
that.
in places like France.
Okay, I love that. I really got to go, but just to drive this home, George Washington's farewell address, this is what you're referring to. The alternate domination of one faction over another is itself a frightful despotism. So, again, you're right. Everyone always goes back to Washington and said, oh, Washington didn't want political parties. But you're saying, no, that's not what he meant by political parties.
Yeah, no, I mean, what we have is a system that forces all these factions to work together, right? It's Madison's Federalist 10 idea that you have a big country, you have a big system, and you can force all these people who maybe, like you say, right, there are a lot of Democrats who don't like other Democrats. There are a lot of Republicans who don't like other Republicans, but they've got no choice. They have to work together because we got this pesky Constitution, we got this pesky Electoral College, and all these checks and balances. And so they have to grin and bear it and build these big coalitions. And it's a scary, messy, beautiful thing that helps protect our liberty.
Oh, gosh, I like that a lot. Okay, the movie Safeguard, an Electoral College Story. It's on Amazon. Just go watch it. It's free. What are you doing? It takes an hour. Safeguard, an Electoral College Story. Trent England from SaveOurStates.org. Beautiful, Trent. Love it. Thanks for your insight.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Really good. Superb. Dems plot to undo America. Now you know why we shouldn't let them. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word.